Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here, in what is a sort of follow-up to the Chronicles of Cain Requiem preview video to give some quick first impressions of the preview build of the Player's Handbook that was distributed to the Kickstarter backers late last week. The lore teaser behind us, and with everyone on the same page after having had a good few days to go through the relevant crunch and fluff and discuss particulars. Here are a few thoughts that I have upon reading through it. Similar to my previous first impressions for the Monsternomicon, this will be primarily from a lore content perspective. As per the Monsternomicon, the presentation is very clean and crisp, with an aesthetic that is consistent with said volume, and it packs a fair amount into what is seemingly a rather smaller volume than the second iteration IKRPG Full Metal Fantasy Core rulebook. But this is primarily because there's no need to rehash rules and setup content from the 5th edition D&D Player's Handbook, while the earlier volume was a completely from the ground up book. Additional gameplay content largely covers the core aspects of the Iron Kingdoms that needed new mechanics to handle, namely Focus, Mechanica, and Steamjacks, plus a couple others here and there. Fury, Spirit Bonds, and War Beasts will no doubt make their appearance in an expansion much like Unleashed did for Full Metal Fantasy. A fair bit of qualification will need to go into what is next, but by comparison, the more or less 50 pages of lore and accompanying art may strike some as disappointing when compared to the 90 or so that does the world building in IKRPG FMF. In and of itself, these 50 pages are filled almost to bursting at the seams, as it were, in terms of sheer information it throws at the reader, which can be both a good and bad thing, exchanging minutiae and detail for somewhat more general coverage. For veterans of the setting, who I believe make up a significant proportion of the Kickstarter campaign backers, quite how much I can't say though, the summarised presentation of the history will be acceptable, as we can fill in the holes with other publications. This also applies to those who have less of a vested interest in what they wish to know about the world they'll be partaking of. On the flip side, I do realise a lot of RPG players do like being immersed in the world their campaigns take place in. So for such players and those like myself who are invested in the histories and fates of characters, populations and pantheons and so forth, there will invariably be a great deal of head-scratching, since a lot of names are dropped with minimal context, and with little by way of intimacy, as it were, and certain passages outright invite questions. While there may not necessarily be any lack of understanding of the circumstances Western Immoren finds itself in, there will definitely be a desire to know more, whether it be individual or national motivations, origins, justifications, partial biographical accounts, or even plain details, and so on, even if something has to give in what to include and exclude. Nevertheless, in addition to laying the foundation of the post-claiming world of Immoren, at least the western half of it, the book addresses Crick's rule and Ios to greater extents than in Full Metal Fantasy, almost to the point of parity relative to the respective nations prominent in the setting, and it does so while also implicitly including them as part of the titular Iron Kingdoms, which is a strange feature, but only if one wishes to be pedantic about such things. For purists, the Iron Kingdoms should only refer to the human nations of Western Immoren, while the others fall under the Beyond the Iron Kingdoms, in inverting commas, section in the older rulebook. Acceptance of this is down to the individual, but some might see value in making this distinction in the layout of the appropriate sections of the book, and not just in the narrative lore, even if I personally see this as a somewhat petty gripe. Then, in what I see to be a bit of a side grade, though I can see this being argued either way, is the reshuffling of the more mundane parts of the lore. This is what would be categorised as the finer details of such things as industry, legal matters, trade, education, and so on, much of which does little to educate newcomers about the setting itself, and is instead additional flavour that can be seen as, debatably, excessive for the gameplay experience, even if not necessarily unwelcome. It's spread out for each constituent nation here, even though there is somewhat less of it. However, it is perhaps a bit premature to judge at this point due to the inclusion of some of these aspects of the setting that are stretch goals and additional documents not explicitly part of the core book, which will add no few pages to the available lore as provided in the preview that we've seen thus far, which I understand to be in the process of being compiled. Moreover, in FMF, this content, despite there being a fair amount of it, was very much centred around the human nations, with what felt like only cursory mention of the other races and states, especially given the major expansion for said human nations in Kings, Nations and Gods, which only exacerbated this perception. But I'll discuss this further when I do a second ed retrospective. All this said, however, I can't really fault the accompanying narrative explanations for gameplay features, even if much of it will be familiar to veteran players. It's expanded at points, especially with welcome mention of more Crixian predilections, and rewritten to be more prosaic at others, and it works well in most instances. Thus, there is something to be said wherein, as per page 232 of the preview build, as a setting over 2 decades old, the Iron Kingdoms simply has more lore and history than can be packed into a single, liftable tome. A statement which is only mild hyperbole. This was true when IKRPG Full Metal Fantasy was released, so it's even more applicable now, given how there have been 2 major time skips in the intervening time, and a lot of world-affecting events at each point. I would have loved for it to be longer, a great deal longer, detailing everything for everyone and everywhere. But this is an unreasonable expectation, and I acknowledge that when it came down to assembling this player handbook, it must have been a headache in considering what to omit, as well as what to include, but was not necessarily essential. Thus, I'm satisfied with this book, if with the hope that the final version of it will sneak in a few more tidbits here and there. And I look forward to the future of IKRPG Requiem, and learning more about Immoren, and other parts of Kane post-claiming. Looking at Yuzu and New Ixia in particular. So, on to the campaign book.